Hello! In this video we're going to take a little look at the case of Phineas Gage, which is a classic case in neuroscience which has taught us a lot about the normal functioning of the brain, particularly the frontal lobes. So who was Phineas Gage? Well, Phineas Gage was an American living in the USA in the 19th century. This is a picture of him here on the right hand side. And his job, part of his job at least, was to clear the way for railway tracks to be laid. And what he used to do was drill a hole in any large boulders that they might encounter, put gunpowder in that hole, and then squash the gunpowder down with this iron tamping bar. And the idea being that if you could crush the gunpowder, squash it tight, it would produce a much bigger explosion. Now one day Gage was going about his business when accidentally a spark flew off the tamping iron and ignited the gunpowder in the hole. And this bar went from a relatively innocuous looking iron bar to a rocket powered javelin, and it went through his head. And the course of this bar was it went underneath his left cheekbone, through the left orbit, through the frontal lobes of his brain, and out through the top of his head. Now, by some miracle, Phineas Gage survived this accident, but as we'll discuss shortly, he wasn't quite the same. Let's take a closer look at the course that the iron bar took by looking at this three-dimensional view of a CT scan performed on his skull. We can see here is the exit wound of the bar, where a flap of bone was displaced from the anterior portion of his skull, and we can see that the bone has largely healed back up, but still leaving some rather large defects which never filled in life. If we look underneath his left cheekbone, we can see where the bar went. So here we're looking here at the path that the bar took as it passed through his head. So we can see it went under his left cheekbone. It broke through the floor of his left orbit here and entered his orbit, destroying his left eye and the optic nerve, rendering him blind in the left eye. And if you look at his photograph, you can see that his left eyelid there is, I think, probably sewed together because he lost his left eye. The bar then went through the roof of his left orbit, through the frontal lobes of his brain, and then out through the top of his head. So what Phineas Gage suffered was effectively an accidental frontal lobotomy, where a large portion of his frontal lobes were either destroyed directly or disconnected from the rest of his brain. Now, Phineas Gage before the accident is said to have been relatively mild-mannered, quite an innocuous kind of guy. However, after the accident, it is said that his character changed completely, and that he became much more impulsive and much more aggressive. And it's actually from the documented changes in his behaviour that we have come to some of our conclusions about the normal function of the frontal lobe. In a nutshell, it's thought that the frontal lobes are involved, along with many other functions, but that they're largely involved in behavioural inhibition. That is, making sure that we behave appropriately in a given situation. However, the case of Phineas Gage, we can learn more from it than just the functions of the frontal lobes. Because what we have found is that over the years in the scientific literature, this is including neuroscience textbooks, the case of Phineas Gage has become embellished. So there's been a certain element of embellishment and also one of Chinese whispers, where stuff that never happened to him originally is said to have occurred. And this is down to the fact that, of course, when people write textbooks, when they write papers, they're using older sources. Those older sources probably use sources before them. And people, in fact, rarely go back to the primary sources that these cases are based upon. And if you want to learn more about the case of Phineas Gage, I'm going to link to a book accompanying this video where you can find out more about this most fascinating case. So thank you very much for listening.